All right, bonus round. This content to preface is actually going to be absolutely useless if you are a sales rep. This is more for the marketing people. If you're an owner of the business, if you're a product manager, if you're a growth hacker, I think this will be a very interesting framework that you can explore in terms of creating viral campaigns. I like to go through this because from my experience in terms of content and frameworks, this is probably the most scientific, but also the most clear-cut outline in terms of how you can design campaigns and also referability into your product or service. So let's dive into it. First, to preface, the whole framework and everything that I'm about to share in this presentation is actually based on the book Contagious by Jonah Berger. So there is really no unique content here that is stuff that I'm creating. I'm summarizing a book. It's a great book. Definitely go check it out if you're interested in doing a deeper dive. But I think this is a pretty comprehensive summary, and it'll go into a lot of details. So in his book, Jonah talks a lot about how influencers help in terms of spreading the message. They have a large audience, but generally they're not sufficient enough. If you don't have the right kind of campaign, if you don't have the right kind of products, even if you pay a ton of money to good influencers, sometimes some things will still fail to go viral. The second thing is he talks a bit about how virality needs to be actually built into the campaign directly, or the product or the service. So it's not just having a product and running something that is kind of cool, kind of interesting, and people will naturally want to share about it. So he talks about kind of putting in elements into the actual product campaign that will actually make people want to share. So he'll go into, and I'll go into the framework that he uses in a second. Lastly, he talks a bit about internal versus external motivation to share. So one thing that I've seen here firsthand as well is to kind of summarize what that means is generally most people have an internal desire to share about something. So that's an internal driven motivation. And then you have external motivation factors like giving people credits, paying them in order to incentivize sharing. And what he finds in his studies is that when you provide external motivation, it tends to decrease internal motivation as a result. And I've seen that firsthand when we ran a referral program at the incubator accelerator that I work for. When we offered referral credits or payment in terms of cash for referrals, we actually saw that our referrals dropped to zero, strangely. So generally, if people are sharing without incentives, they're sharing because they want to share out of their own volition, and they are more driven to actually do it. So generally, try to avoid external motivation if you can. What is interesting that he'll talk about in the book is that there is no perfect way to design a viral campaign. There are these elements in the framework that he will talk about that will help encourage shareability. But generally, when we think about viral campaigns, like viral in the sense of something like, let's say, the ALS bucket challenge or something getting shared often, right? Those viral campaigns depend a little bit on some of these elements, but also a little bit on luck. And the luck component there and then involves things like, sharing on the right platforms, getting the right early adopters to engage with it, and somehow getting picked up by the algorithms as well. So some of those things we can't control, but there are a few other things that we can design into the campaign or the product to encourage the likelihood of people wanting to share what we're doing. So keep that in mind as we move forward. So the steps that he shares in his book is called STEPS, STEPPS. The first S stands for social currency. We'll go through each of them in more detail. The T stands for trigger, and then emotion, public, practical value, and stories. So social currency. Social currency is an example of internal motivation. So basically, this is people want to share something when they feel that it is going to make them look good in some way, right? So that's what social currency means. So what does it? What can you do to your product, to your campaign, that will make the sharer look good in some way? So some tips he gives in and around this section is, number one is people like to share remarkable or amazing things, right? Because it makes them, by association, someone who is also remarkable, someone who's also interesting, someone who's also cool. So can you in some way build some remarkability, some interesting facts into your campaign or your product that will generally kind of incentivize people to share it more, because that gives them some form of social currency. Make sense? The second one is some form of scarcity or kind of exclusivity, right? People, if they share exclusive knowledge that no one else has, then they will feel like, hey, I'm privy to this knowledge that no one else knows, and I want to brag about it. Or there's a limited information, and I'm one of the few people who has this kind of thing. So that scarcity, that kind of sense of status, that is something that people like to talk about. The third one is gamification. So in and around gamification here is you're thinking about how can you quantify performance, because people like to brag. People like to be the leader, right? Having leaderboards, those kind of things. Thinking about different ways where you can make people feel more valuable and thus motivating them to share more. So I'll go into some examples in and around these three things to help you understand them a bit better. So the first example is looking at how airlines or frequent flyer travel plans or credit cards or memberships kind of do it. So they use gamification, and what happens is when you accumulate points on your travel card, then you get exclusive access to special perks or lounges. And when people get to travel, like they get first class travel because of their let's say air miles, or if they get into a VIP lounge, they like to share and brag about it, because it's like, hey, look, I got exclusive access to this. It's the same reason why if you look at Foursquare back in the days, I don't know what Foursquare is called now, but they had this campaign where when you checked into locations, you could earn a mayor badge if you were the most frequently checked into that location. It's the same reason why you see with Niantic and Pokemon Go, people want to conquer those gyms, right? So that is the gamification of status element there. People like to brag, like, hey, I own this place, like I'm the leader in this area, or I'm the highest scoring in this kind of thing. So that's one component, one element. In and around remarkability, one example he gives is Snapple. So Snapple, what they did is they ran a campaign where they printed fun facts and interesting facts on the bottom of their bottle caps. And this kind of helps the sharer seem knowledgeable, right? So people tend to find out interesting things, and they're like, oh, did you know blah, 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 blah? Oh, I read it on the bottom of a Snapple cap. And that's how their campaign went very viral. In and around exclusivity and scarcity, one example he gives is there's this bar in New York City, and it's a speakeasy bar. And how it's set up is you go into the restaurant, it's actually set up like I think it's like a hot dog shop. And you go in and you go to the back, and there is this phone, and you dial a special code, and the back of the phone booth opens up into a secret bar. And they don't do any ads, they don't do any marketing, but the bar is always full. And this is because people think it's like really cool, right? There's that remarkability piece, but it's also like exclusive information that I have. Like no one else knows this. And they actually call their bar, please don't tell. So people actually want to tell others about it. It's the same reason why, if you have things like, let's say, member exclusive flash sales, or if you have very unique information where, if, let's say, for example, I think I have this in the next slide. So the 1+1, or back in the days, if you remember, even Google, to get a Gmail account or to get a OnePlus phone, you had to first get an invitation, and you can only get an invitation from someone else who already got the phone, right? So that's leveraging that network effect of exclusivity. So here, like when you buy a phone, a OnePlus phone, you get 3 invites that you can send out to a friend. And then same with Google. When you get a Google account, then you can, I think it was 5 people that you could invite, but that's how they kind of piggybacked on that sense of exclusivity to get people to want to share and people to want to request those invitations, right? So consider how you can do some of those things. Another example that I talked about previously when I was going into how the Nada grocery store in Vancouver, how they actually created a sense of community. And one of the things that they did is they started a Facebook group, and it was set up as a closed group. And by being a closed group, generally members, if they know someone else who would benefit from the group, they would invite people to the group. Because if it's an open group, members are not as incentivized to invite people in. Make sense? So how can you kind of lean on some of that exclusivity elements and get people to think like, hey, I'm an insider? Dropbox is another interesting example. If you look at how they designed Dropbox, they didn't just build it in and around a campaign, but they built referability into the actual product itself. What was interesting with them is when they were going out, testing growth, testing marketing, they found that everything that they were trying to do with traditional advertising was not working. But strangely, they saw that they were still growing, still acquiring users, but most of it was not coming from marketing. So they dig deeper and said, hey, where are we getting our users from? And turns out they were finding that most of their users were joining because they were coming from other users referring them. So they said, okay, we'll focus our acquisition efforts on building referrals. And we built, what they did is they build it directly into the product itself and the onboarding process, right? When you sign up for Dropbox, there's a reward-based referral system. Refer a friend and you get more space, they also get more space. Notice here, they don't give cash. Generally, you want to try to avoid cash referrals. Two reasons. One, like that is the external motivation factor that we talked a bit about. But when you give people credits to your product or service, or more of your product or service, then it makes it a bit more stickier as well. So they will want to use their credits with you, or that let's say in this case, storage is applicable only to your product or service. Therefore, they get more benefits from your product or service. Make sense? Mailbox is another great example. So here, what you can see over here is when they launched, they had this campaign where basically they created a wait list. So pre-launch, there was a wait list, sign up to get early access. And what they did is they used social proofing here to give people a sense of urgency. Like they can see, hey, there are these many people in front of me, these many people behind me. Then it actually shows, number one, there is an interest. And then number two, what they did is when you refer people, you get bumped up in the wait list. The more you share, the more you get bumped up in the wait list, right? So by building on this, then they actually encourage more people to both share and kind of gamify the system a bit, because people want to be the first to get access. If you're not familiar with Mailbox, to give you some context and backstory, they're a mailing client. And what's interesting is when they launched, it was like, oh, what, another mailing client? There's already, Gmail for your phone and all that kind of stuff. But what they did different is they designed the entire experience around mobile first. Like you could swipe to archive your mail. You could take a picture and attach it directly in the mail client instead of taking a picture on your camera and then attaching it in your email client, that kind of stuff. So yeah, interesting new way. What ended up happening and why you don't probably know of them is they ended up getting bought out by Dropbox, and Dropbox actually ended up moonlighting a lot of their features and kind of shutting them down. But interesting nevertheless. I think they ended up selling to Dropbox for about $100 million. And that was just shortly after launching, because they were able to be so viral and so effective with getting so many customers. So this is an example of the gamification plus using the element of social proofing as well. So social currency, basically the main focus in and around social currency is to motivate the sharer, to get the sharer to want to share something because it makes them look good, it benefits them. The other side of the picture is, yes, social currency gets people sharing, but triggers keep people sharing. So how do you remind people to share? And that's what the key idea or concept of trigger is. And if you're top of mind, if people keep thinking of you, then you're tip of tongue as well. So they're more likely to share about your product or service. So yep, I think we mentioned this. So good triggers, there are certain triggers that are good, certain triggers that are bad. Good triggers generally are triggers that happen often, but not only often, they are triggers that are not already associated with other products or services. So for example, if you try to use Apple as a trigger, it's probably not going to be effective because there's a very big and notable brand named Apple, right? So it should not be already associated with another prominent brand. it should generally also happen in close proximity to your product or service. So I'll give you one example of a bad trigger. So if you look at grocery shopping and reusable bags, most of us will shop, buy our stuff, and then get to the checkout counter and realize, oh crap, we forgot our reusable bags because we left it at home. And that's because the trigger for us to remember that we need the reusable bags is at the checkout counter. So that's too late. So the idea is, if you're trying to change behavior in that kind of form, how can you place a trigger or create something that will help you remember or remind you to grab those recyclable bags even before you get to the grocery store? So maybe it's, leaving it close to your car keys, or maybe leaving it in your car trunk, those kind of things. But generally, the closer proximity it is, then people are less likely to forget about it, forget about sharing your product, forget about your product once they get triggered by whatever the trigger is. Make sense? So, some examples of triggers include things like the association between, peanut butter and jelly, right? When you think PB&J, it's not just peanut butter, but it's peanut butter and jam. It's not just jam. So whenever you mention one or the other, they both get associated. So that kind of drives the sales of both. KitKat also did a pretty good campaign in and around that. I won't play the video, but if you know with KitKat, their tagline is KitKat take a break, right? And taking a break associated, it's something that, is number one, is a frequent trigger. But number two, when you take a break, you generally have a coffee break. And what they did is they placed their vending machines close to a lot of coffee machines. So when you think of taking a break, you're like, oh, take a break, I can easily grab a KitKat as well. So how can you kind of use that element? The Budweiser campaign is also a very interesting one. Again, I'm not going to play this, but if you've seen the video, that was, I think, one of the Super Bowl ads that they had in the past. Gosh, no, this is a really old video. I don't remember when. But what they're doing is twofold. Is number one, they associate their brand with the slang, the "what's up" campaign kind of thing. And that idea of that slang "what's up" is closely associated with number one, friends, number two, parties, number two, watching the game, and kind of that culture and that slang itself. So anytime people were in those kind of environments, they would think of the beer, and i.e. Budweiser in this case, because they were so closely associated and became viral because of that campaign, right? So how can you build that into it? So I'm going to skip over that. This one here, you can see with this anti-campaign ad, it's actually a trigger based on a common association that you see from a quote-unquote competitor. And in this case, when you see that image, if you are familiar with it, you're probably, a millennial like myself. And this brand you would know is Marlboro, the cigarette company. And when you see it, you think, oh, cigarette. And then, Bob, I've got emphysema, right? So it makes you immediately think of smoking right away. So what is the trigger that you can leverage in order to get people to think of your product or service? Triggers can be jingles, it can be tones. So some companies use that to their advantage. I think in his book, he also talks about the company Pepto-Bismol and how they were talking about in their original ads, it was like pop and, that deals with your stomach acid, like a single tablet. And then they changed their ad campaign to pop, and it deals with your stomach acid. So like just changing it to pop instead of pop kind of got consumers to associate it with like, oh, I need 2 tablets instead of 1 tablet, and that actually increased your sales. So not saying that you should manipulate if your customer needs to actually only use 1 tablet instead of versus using 2. But what I want to kind of get you to pay attention to in and around here is, what is the association that you can link your brand or your product or service to, whether it be something that is environmental, that happens close to your product, that happens frequently, or it's maybe something that is habitual or behavioral, that is related to your product or your values or your company, right? So think about what you can associate your product or service with. And if you do a good association, then that will become a good trigger for people to think about sharing as well. The first E that Jonah talks about in and around sharing is emotional. Sorry, there's only one E. And what he focuses on in his studies and experiments is he found that emotional, it's not just about positive emotions. People don't just share good things. People actually like to share bad things as well. And the keyword here is arousal. So when there are things that are, amazing, that generate excitement, amusement, humor, funny, awe, those are positive and high arousal type of emotion. Versus, if you have a something that is themed around getting people to express their satisfaction or contentment, that is positive but low arousal. On the flip side, people love to complain as well. They love to complain about issues. They like to vent their anger. If they're anxious about something, they want to talk about it. So that's negative and high arousal, same thing. But negative and low arousal, like sad, depressing, bleak, those kind of things, don't generally generate a lot of referrals. So when I say referrals here, I'm just mentioning kind of talking about shareability, right? So he talks about, how can you consider leveraging moments of high emotional charge and kind of building your campaigns in and around that. It's either through directly evoking emotion in your audience through storytelling, or maybe it's through kind of being strategic with how you place your ads. And this is the same reason why like a lot of the Super Bowl ads are kind of placed at halftime during the climax, right? When people are really excited and more people are likely to talk and share about it. I think the experiment that he mentioned is just even a simple act of getting someone to run on a treadmill increases the likelihood of someone sharing or talking about something. So, are there physically arousing situations that you can use, that you can leverage, that you can kind of get yourself in front of? And number two, like if you can understand your customer's motivation, their why, then this allows you to kind of, pull on the heartstrings when you build those storytelling related campaigns. Why is your product or service important to them? Get them to talk about that, right? So for example, if you're an airline company, you might ask them to share about bad airline experiences. You might ask them to, if you do certain things, maybe you're going to reward people for or actually build a good experience into what they get. So for example, I think I gave in one of the previous videos in exceeding expectations, JetBlue, they actually saw someone post that there was no Starbucks chain in the airport that they were visiting. So they said, hey, you know what? They reached out to the person on LinkedIn and replied, you'll get free coffee on your flight. So how can you generate those positive moments and leverage that excitement or like exceed people's expectation and get them to want to talk about something? Or on the flip side, get people to vent about certain problems and people will take a stance, and hopefully ideally you don't want to be the company that they're complaining about, but they're going to be complaining about your competitors, right? Or the alternative way of doing or executing or solving the problem. Make sense? Yeah. So these are just some examples in terms of how you can think about using emotion. I've shown this video before. Like this is a great example of storytelling and building emotion into storytelling. It's not about the features. It's about the story of what it enables and how people feel as they go through that journey, right? People don't want to feel like they're being told something. They want to be entertained. They want to be moved. The first P is public. The more something is public, the more people can visually see something. It builds the credibility, it builds trust, and it generates that social proof. People feel like they don't want to be missing out. So consider how you can make something more visible. If they can see it, people will imitate it. So he talks about how certain behaviors, like let's say donating or voting, those behaviors may not be inherently visible. So how can you manifest them in some way? Or he talks a bit about like values, for example, which is why some companies and brands tend to stand out more than others, because they help people communicate their values. People I kind of associate their identity with that brand because it helps them tell the world that, hey, I'm this kind of person. So yeah, thoughts are private, behaviors are public. How can you make them public? Or if there are transient events, let's say if something happens once, how can you create that behavioral residue so that people can continue to see it? And this will help, especially if you have those kind of events or products that are seasonal, that maybe happen once a year or once every few months kind of thing. So if you create behavioral residue, then people can see it. So I'll go into some examples in a second. So here's one example, Movember, the act of donating to men's causes, men's health, mental wellness, prostate cancer, testicular cancer, dealing with male suicide. It becomes visible because people grow out their mustache in November and people wonder about that and they talk about it, right? So how can you raise that awareness? And it's the same reason why the ALS Bucket Challenge did so well, right? Even Bill Gates ended up sharing videos. So how can you create a campaign that gets people to demonstrate that they're supporting a cause or donating towards a cause? It's also the same reason why, restaurants or clubs, they tend to hold people outside, make people line up in order to look busy and to look popular. Even if though sometimes you go into a club, outside there's a long lineup, but inside it's nice and empty, right? So how can you make it more visible such that people will see that you're busy? They gave another example in his book where he talks about Nike, and when they were deciding between their campaign, they had two ideas. One was to create and sell wristbands. Sounded very, very simple. And then the other one was to actually pay Lance Armstrong and get him to go on a campaign to cycle around Europe to raise awareness for cancer. And the latter, creating and selling those wristbands, the former, sounded really, really simple, but it was a great campaign because the wristbands were something that was brightly colored, easily visible, very noticeable, right? So just by getting, Lance Armstrong to be the ambassador, by wearing that wristband and kind of eventually through that spreading that out, people caught on and they said, hey, I want to be able to represent and show my support for cancer. This is the same reason why for every country, they have those I voted stickers. Or if you're in a country where they use election ink, people love to take pictures and show that they voted. It kind of demonstrates the act of patriotism or the behavior of voting, something that you can visually see, right? This one over here is another simple example. The act of emails, when you send an email through Hotmail or when you send an email through your iPhone or Android, it usually says that in the signature, right? Sent via. So that makes it visible, because otherwise, if they didn't have that, you wouldn't know. So that encourages people to just become more aware as well. One bad example that he gives is how in and around kind of encouraging behaviors for drug commercials, their research actually found that most drug commercials actually increase drug usage, because what's actually happening is people see other people doing drugs in those commercials, right? in those anti-drug campaigns. Instead, what's more effective is to highlight what people should be doing instead. So think about what you are making visible. What are you giving visibility to as well? On the practical value side, the second P, he talks about as a mirror to social currency is focused on the sharer. Practical value is focused on the receiver. Practical value is how can you give the receiver something that is beneficial? Because if there is some practical value in and around your campaign, your product or service, people will want to share it with someone else because they know it will be valuable to that person that they're sharing it with. Make sense? So, what's that news that you can use? How can you give people some insider knowledge, help them, make more money, save time, save money, those kind of things, or have a good experience. So, good deals, like things that are highly unexpected or limited, right? If it's scarce, if it's perceived as a really good value, then people want to share it. Not only because it makes them look good on the social currency side of things, but it also helps the other person that they're sharing with. One tip that he talks about is to leverage practical value effectively, you have to have a very clear idea and identification of who is going to benefit from that content or that kind of campaign that you're putting out there. Because generally, if it's too broad, it's hard to think about who to share it with. But when it's very specific, people immediately think, oh, I know that person, right? So an example here is, if you are thinking about how to select a shoe, that's too general. You wouldn't know who to share that with. But if you say how to select a ballet shoe, immediately I know, oh, you know what? I know a friend of mine, he has a daughter that does ballet classes. Maybe you can share it with him. So the more specific you make a content, the more narrow and the more targeted it is, the easier it is for someone to think about who to share it with. The last S is in and around storytelling. And the key here is, number one, not using kind of those kind of shock factors, or he talks about this kind of publicity stunts, but instead associating a strong story that is related to your brand. Because people generally like to tell stories. We as humans, that's kind of how we are programmed, right? Our stories are much more engrossing than facts. And in and around, by sharing the story of, let's say, your customer or someone actually going through the journey of solving a problem or trying a service and getting value out of it, you're also not just telling, but you're demonstrating, showing by example. So it's not just saying things like, hey, we have great customer service, but you're actually, people will be willing to share your story or their story of a good customer service experience that they have, because that is more memorable to them, that is more relatable for them, right? So people trust stories. So a good story is, number one, related to your product or service. It's not a publicity stunt, and you need to remember what gets shared, because the more a story is passed along, the more people will forget certain components in and around the storytelling. So your brand needs to be a key component of the stories. So I'll play this video because I think this is a pretty good example. So let me see if I can get this one. Oh, I can't play that here. Let me open up a separate video. And I will share the sound of the campaign. So this one is a pretty good example that he gives.
Okay, folks, so great quiet, please. Cameras rolling. And we're recording sound. It's slated. Sounds great.
So what I want you to notice in and around this campaign is, number one, it's using a very clear story to help you see like, oh, wow, our perception of beauty is really distorted. Number two, it's identifying a common enemy as well. We talked about that in copywriting. So it's saying like, hey, look, all these other beauty products, they have a kind of agenda in and around promoting how their products make you look more presentable or more beautiful than you actually are, than is even humanly possible, right? So they're taking a stance on, that's the common enemy, that's the alternative. We are not about that. We are about celebrating natural beauty, right? And then number three, it's also kind of polarizing as well. So taking a stance on what beauty is defined. And you notice here it's really also about them sharing their values and what they believe beauty represents. So if you can work some of those elements in. It's not that you have to work all of them in, and same goes for the steps framework itself. You don't have to have all of them, but the more elements you can work into your campaign, the higher the likelihood of it being more viral. Make sense? So I'll give another example of coming from his book as well, of a bad example of a campaign.
The hip it to the hip, hip, how you don't stop the rocket to the bang, bang, boogie set up, jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie to beat.
Now what you hear is not a test, I'm rocking to the beat, and me, the groove, and my friends are gonna try to move your feet. See, I am Wonder Mike, and I'd like to say hello. Bang, 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 boogie to the boogie, the up, jump the boogie to the bang, bang, boogie, let's rock.
You don't stop.
Rock the rhythm that'll make your body rock.
Well, so far you heard my voice within a brought two friends along.
And next on the mic is my man Hank. Come on,
Come and sing that song, that song.
So I know it's a bit of an outdated example as well, but the tenet around kind of showing some of these examples is to understand that these behaviors and kind of bias psychology does not change over time. Like now the mediums that we use and the campaigns that are running are, mostly like, platforms like TikTok and Instagram, Facebook. But generally, like if you see with this campaign, yes, it was funny. It was, it's cute. It's outrageous. It's like kind of out of what you expect babies to be doing these kind of things. So this campaign back in the days, it actually ended up becoming quite a viral campaign. But most people ended up not remembering what mineral water company was associated with that advertisement, because it's a publicity stunt, so to speak. It doesn't really stand strongly for the brand's values. And like, who thinks about babies when they think about water, or think about water when they think about babies? Make sense? So think about what you associate your brand with in and around storytelling. I'll give you another example of a bad, like in my opinion, terrible ad. I heard it, I think 2 years ago back on Spotify. So it's an audio only ad, but it should give you a clear picture as well.
Me, but also you. The Pharaoh fast forwards his favorite foreign film, Powder Donut. Okay, what's my line?
The only line I see here on the script is get options based on your budget with the name your price tool from Progressive.
Oh man, that's a tongue twister, huh? I'm sorry, I'm gonna need a few more minutes. Bulbous Walrus, the Bulbous Walrus.
The name your price tool, only from Progressive.
The owl ran afoul of the comatose coxswain.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Like, excuse my language, but that's the kind of situation where you run an ad and your customer thinks, what the hell did I just hear? And they don't remember your company. They just remember, what the hell was that, right? Yes, it catches their attention, but like they don't, like, what is it about? It doesn't tell me what your company is about. It doesn't tell me what your company represents. And I'm struggling to even think of the name of the company. So like, even for me to search this up, it was quite a task, because I couldn't even remember the name of the company or the ad itself. This is one example he gives in his book, where there's this guy who is famous for streaking games, Mark Roberts, and people remember the streaking incidents that he has, like, running naked through the field during this game, but they don't ever associate the company related to sponsoring him, like this GoldenPalace.com, a casino company. So don't just think about those kind of publicity stunts and do it for the sake of generating buzz. Yes, it might generate buzz. Yes, it might go viral, but no one will remember your brand or your company anyways. So what's the point of doing that then? So kind of to summarize the key takeaways in and around steps. Number one, social currency. What can you do to make your product? So what can you do to your product or campaign that will make the sharer, make them look good? Can you find some inner remarkability? Can you leverage game mechanics? Can you make people feel like insiders? Triggers is, what is the context? What are the cues that you can create in and around your product or idea? How can you grow the habit and make it come to mind more often? Emotion, focus on feelings. What kind of emotions do you generate? How can you kindle that fire? Can you get something that is arousing, right? Public, how can you make your product or idea advertise itself? Can people see when other people are using it? If not, how can you make private behavior public? Can you create behavioral residue? So another example here is, let's say if you have a product or a product company, how can you make it visible such that people talk about the product that they buy, right? Are there campaigns that you can use that will, if you share a picture of you using the product, you'll get something, right? Like the kind of thing will help people share it more often as well. Practical value. How does it help people help others? How can you highlight incredible value, package your knowledge and expertise into useful information? Stories, what is your Trojan horse? Your product or idea is embedded in a broader narrative that people want to share. So yeah, I hope this framework is helpful for you. Like I say, you don't have to incorporate all elements of STEP, but the more you can use, the better. So hopefully that helps you start to think about how you can either design more viral, better marketing campaigns, but not only that, like even making adjustments to your product directly, or maybe the onboarding experience or service like you saw with Dropbox, because a lot of it is not purely reliant on marketing. All right, that's it for the video.